Boyd Hilton is the entertainment director at Heat magazine. He's involved with the Pilot magazine, and he writes for The Guardian, The Evening Standard, The Huffington Post, GQ, Empire, and When Saturday Comes. You've heard him on Radio 2, Radio 4, 5 Live. He's involved with BAFTA. He can also be heard on the excellent Pilot TV podcast. Boyd Hilton, welcome to the Zoomcast.
Thanks, Graham. That was a great list.
It's quite a list you've built up there. What qualifies you to be a TV critic then?
Oh, nothing. I mean, no, that's not true. I would say I've been watching TV obsessively since I can remember, since I was, I don't know, 5 or something, and have built up some level of expertise when it comes to knowledge of television. And then writing about it, I'll leave others to judge, and talking about it, whether I have any expertise on that level. But I'm certainly obsessed with television, so yeah. And film to a large extent as well.
Yeah, with the BAFTA involvement, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let's get on to this news that broke, I don't know, is it last night or this morning, that Fawlty Towers, the episode of Don't Mention the War, Mention It Once, Think I Got Away with It. I think the episode, is it called The Germans, the episode?
Yeah.
It's been removed from UKTV's streaming service. What do you think of that?
Well, I think this is a very specific case of this episode, because people are getting a bit confused. So it's not the fact that this is the episode where Fawlty does the silly walk and makes fun of the Germans and talks about the war.
It's not that episode.
It is the episode. No, it is the episode. But the element of the episode that is considered to be unacceptable is that the Major has lines of dialogue where he says uses racist terms.
Is he talking about cricket?
Yeah. Yeah,
I know what you mean, and he does actually use racist terms. Yes.
So, and what's happened is years ago, like I think 3 or 4 years ago, the BBC, because the BBC repeats Fawlty Towers itself, it's repeated on BBC Two every now and then, and they actually removed those words from the episode, just those words, keeping in all the scenes, with John Cleese's approval, and somehow the version that UKTV's had in its online portal, if you like, did not include those edits. So they should have edited them out anyway, really. So the official version that should be watched now, as far as John Cleese is concerned, doesn't have those racist words in it. And I think it's also been on Netflix, the unedited version. So I think it's just a case of editing those words. The headline story that, this episode is being removed forever and I think that's not the case in this particular example.
I can see how, because I got confused. I saw that the Germans thing, and I thought, because I'm quite friendly with a German guy. In fact, I'm talking to him tomorrow, and we've talked about that episode, and it doesn't bother him in the slightest. And I don't think many German people are offended by that. But I can see how people have made the jump and think, oh, right, I see.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that scene with the Major, have they cut it out altogether, or do they kind of just silence the words?
I think they've just cut those lines. Yeah, somehow. I don't know whether I don't know whether they've cut the scene altogether or just. I mean, they could just cut the scene altogether. I think that would be fine. I don't think it would affect the general narrative of that episode.
No, not at all. I think it was an aside. Yeah.
Yeah, and Basil Fawlty also. I mean, it has always been. I remember watching that episode honestly, and I'm not saying myself as any kind of prodigy or anything, but I watched Fawlty Towers when it first was broadcast, and I was probably 8-9 years old. And I remember that episode being uncomfortable viewing them because it's also got Basil Fawlty being racist as well.
Has it? Okay.
Yeah. And that's, but that, I think it was clearly depicting racism as a bad thing.
Yeah.
So I think that, I think it's fine, we're white guys talking. I'm sure, some people may be offended by the episode, by other elements of the episode, but I don't think there's any great question that anyone is calling for the whole episode to be banned forever.
Right, I see.
Yeah.
Well, it comes on the back of a lot of people apologizing for blackface. Keith Lemon, Anton Deck have apologized. I'm not sure if Little Britain have yet, whether David Walliams and co have, but they were involved as well, weren't they, in blackface?
Yeah. They said again a while ago that if they were making the show now, they wouldn't do those characters. I think,
yeah. Do you agree with that then? That maybe because Anton Dex has been pulled from the streaming service that it was on. I forget what it was.
Yeah, I think it's fair enough. I think we're. By the way, I think generally, the main, this seems a slightly trivial element of the whole Black Lives Matter movement. This whole thing that's arising at the moment. You know, I don't think, you know, episodes of Fawlty Towers and Bo Selector are the main, you know, or any kind of subject that the Black Lives Matter movement. I think they've got bigger fish to fry. You know, I think racism generally, you know, and representation and, you know, the police brutality, these are all big issues. Yeah. And I think this is a smaller issue. I still think it's important because I still think white comedians, white people in general, are using blackface, you know, which goes back to the black and white minstrel show and Hollywood in, you know, decades ago. And that is a racist thing to do intrinsically for white performers to don black makeup like that. Now, I don't want, you know, there's the nitty gritty of, is the League of Gentlemen involved and is that character actually a black character? I don't think it was. I think that was actually about a white person using black makeup. You know, people are talking about Ali G, and that was always actually, that's a white character, you know, kind of using, you know, urban speak, culture, if you like, culture. And it was, and actually that was really a satire on white people trying to be more urban, trying to be black, if you like. So these are complicated issues. And Ant and Dec were doing, that's one, you know, there were scenes where they you know, they did disguise themselves in heavy makeup, and they did unwisely, I think, you know, use ethnic characters, you know. And so generally I do think it is offensive. It's an offensive thing to do. And as I said, I think the Little Britain guys wouldn't do that now. And I feel like, you know, and people will be offended by it because it is fundamentally ludicrous for white people to play black characters. But there are little just nuances of detail, if you like, in the general sweep of people assuming that all of these things are the same. Not, you know, they're not all necessarily the same. They're not all the same as the black and white minstrel show. But, you know, we're white people talking about it again. And I do think quite rightly it's wrong. And no one now, if you're making a show now of any kind, if you're thinking, and I don't think anyone will, because it'd be idiotic, but to don blackface for a white performer is not acceptable. Absolutely.
Yeah. And the thing is, if somebody says they are offended by something, you can't argue with that. If they're offended, they're offended. Right. And you shouldn't go out to offend people. Yeah. And I'm sure they weren't when they made those shows. That wasn't the idea of it. But if that's what's happened, well then it's time to backpedal. It makes me wonder, because if putting on blackface to make fun or ridicule people who are of color, or whatever the politically correct way to describe that is, because we're all worried now, is something like Harry Enfield and the Scousers sketch. I know that is very offensive to people in Liverpool. It is. And it's probably I would argue that maybe it is just as offensive to people in Liverpool as it is for people of colour to see someone in blackface, whether that could be the next step.
Well, I think I would say, I mean, I'm sure you're right that the use of that stereotype is offensive to people in Liverpool, and absolutely fair enough. You know, I'm Jewish, so I'm very alert to anything that I consider to be anti-Semitic, and there are many examples in the history of culture and art and entertainment of things that I consider to be blatantly anti-Semitic, and I would be happy about. But I do think racism is complicated and is all about power relations as well. I think you have to bear in mind, you know, I think there's a difference between Harry Enfield making fun of other white stereotypes. And I do think a lot of these cases, and I think Harry Enfield is part of this, is all about satirizing stereotypes to some extent. You know, I think they, you know, it's slightly more complicated than just saying, I don't think he was ever saying about any of his characters, you know, the shows that he did with Paul Whitehouse and Kathy Burke, you know, and Little Britain, this goes for a little bit as well. Well, in fact, to a large extent, these are all sketch shows, interestingly, where the main cast, if you like, are performing all kinds of types, and they really are. And that's a lot of comedy, particularly sketch comedy, is, you know, using stereotypes, poking fun at stereotypes, and often satirizing stereotypes. And there's a very fine line, isn't there, between, you know, was Harry Enfield exposing a stereotype about people from Liverpool, or was he just making fun of people from Liverpool? Now, I'm not from Liverpool. I don't know. I don't think Harry Enfield and Paul Whitehouse are racist, or, you know, were making fun or were seeking to insult people from Liverpool, or, you know, anything like that. But equally, again, if you're doing these shows now, you have to be more sensitive perhaps than people were 10, 15, 20 years ago about playing with stereotypes. You have to be very careful. I think you have to make it crystal clear that you're satirizing and commenting on the act of stereotyping rather than being stereotyping yourself, rather than being racist or bigoted or, you know, or making fun or generalizing about people from Liverpool.
Yeah, I think, you know, if I think of Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech, and he says something, and I'm paraphrasing, I can't remember exactly, but he said he hopes that his children are judged by their character rather than the color of their skin. And I think that's what the area that they get into is a prejudice. If you're saying, if you speak with this accent, then you are this kind of person. And, you know, a lot of people from Liverpool are described as thieves because they sound that way. Well, that clearly is just exactly the same as a racial stereotype. And I also wonder if, now that the blackface is a thing, if you look at, say, something like, you know, Lee and Dean, did you see that show on Channel 4? Yeah. There's two middle-class comedy writers and performers dress up as working-class people with hard hats and high-vis jackets and make them look pretty silly. And I wonder if you could argue that that's almost a blackface for working-class people and people who work in trades and, you know, blue-collar people. I don't know. I don't know whether we're into a really tricky area here.
No, I think it's interesting. I think you have to get into the nitty-gritty, fair enough. But I would say about Lee and Dean, I think they were very fond. There were characters that I think you like. And I think as that show wore on, and I think, you know, I really liked Lee and Dean. I thought it was a great show. And I think middle-class people, middle-class white people have to be able to portray working-class white people. I think, you know, I don't have a problem, particularly, as I say, I'm Jewish, with non-Jewish actors playing Jewish people. You know, it's fine. I'm fine with it. A lot of people think that, you know, gay actors should only play gay characters. That is a thing. You know, I don't necessarily agree with that. It's absolutely unacceptable, as I think we've clearly established, for white people to play black characters.
Yeah.
But these things are nuanced. And I think with Lee and Dean, I don't think they are taking the piss out of them for being working class. I actually think they're portraying, it's all about deepening our understanding of those characters. And that, you know, there were, I think, 2 series of that show, 6 episodes, 12 episodes. Yeah. And I think you grew to love them. And I think, you know, I think that's the difference, I think, between, you know, a stereotypical portrayal. I think it's different from a stereotypical portrayal of a group of people where you're, you know, the phrase punching up and punching down. I don't think Lee and Dean are punching down and taking the piss out of working class people. I just don't think that's what they're doing.
Well, let's talk about the state of TV as it is. With so much stuff out there and so much on demand and the money being piled into the likes of Netflix, are we in a golden age of television? Oh,
undoubtedly. I mean, you know, I would say I watch, you know, every week now. You know, my main job is writing about TV for 2 different magazines and the podcast, as you said, the Pilot TV podcast. And every week, I would say, without exaggeration, there are a handful of, at the very least, brilliantly made, technically superb TV shows every single week. You know, and they're often beyond being technically brilliant. They're often really well written and brilliantly acted as well. So, you know, I think the Netflix, Amazon Prime explosion, if you like, you know, those channels spend billions every year on content, that horrible word content, but on new TV series, most of them scripted. And I think everyone's raising their game. You know, I think the BBC drama output has never been better. I think ITV's doing some great stuff. Not at the moment, you know, due to lockdown. There's mostly repeats on ITV 24. But honestly, there's really good stuff coming up. And I just think everyone's had to raise their game. So yeah, every single week, honestly, there's like 2 or 3 fantastic drama or comedy shows, brand new. And it's astonishing. It is absolutely astonishing. And TV is the place, you know. I love film, and you know, there are loads of films still being made, obviously, and every week probably, 6 or 7 new films going on. But I think the quality of TV now is generally of a much higher standard than even the world of film.
Yeah, Ken Levine, who was my guest the other day on the Zoomcast, he's a writer in Hollywood. He worked on MASH and Cheers and Frasier and all the rest of it. He reckons that the food chain used to be movies, television, street performing, radio. and the only thing that's changed is that TV and movies may have switched places, and TV may be at the top right now.
Oh, I think so. If you look at the talent involved, people like the Reese Witherspoons and Nicole Kidmans and of this world are foregrounding TV. Reese Witherspoon alone, I wrote an article about it recently. When you look into it, she's, producing, executive producing, co-creating.
What was that last thing she did when she was in the newsroom? What was that called? She was great
The Morning Show with Jennifer Aniston. Yeah, fantastic. On Apple
and she
TV,
was really good in it.
Phenomenal.
Too.
She's brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And she's she's creating for herself the kind of roles she wasn't getting in films. And that's what a lot of, I think, top cinema talent are doing. They're creating their own stuff now. They're exec producing and commissioning writers to create stuff, because you can tell deeper stories. You can go deeper into stories, and you create more three-dimensional, nuanced roles for yourself in television than you can in film. So I think the primacy of TV is beyond doubt now. Yeah.
I think the thing with TV, it's become almost like podcasts. The challenge is discovery, and maybe we need you as a TV critic more than we ever did.
Oh, honestly, this is exactly why we started the Pilot TV podcast, because it's a curation thing.
Yeah,
and we started the magazine as well, which we do. Comes out quarterly with Empire. Empire's a film magazine, and there's so much TV. There's so much brilliant cinematic TV. If you have a big enough television, you watch these shows and they look stunning. They're all filmed, with just as much care and artistry as a big film. Yeah. So we curate. We try and point out. We try and pick out the good and the bad, as you say, to help discovery. Yeah, and that's the key. I think you need more when you've got 500 new shows every year now. I mean, geez, you have to. Hopefully my job as a TV critic is more important than ever. Yeah,
it used to be like that. If you go back to music, it was always like a really cool friend that would turn you on to a particular artist or album or something, or maybe an older brother or cousin or something. And it's getting that way with TV. I was turned on to a show by listening to a podcast. Actually, I was listening to Penn Jillette's Penn Sunday School, Penn Jillette from Penn and Teller.
Penn and Teller, yeah.
And he interviewed a guy. Gee, I wish I knew his name. You'll probably get it. It's a show. It's either called Patriot or The Patriot. And it's about a CIA guy who's a folk singer. And it is just so dark and quirky. And I'm into the second season of it now. And there's no way I would have found that without listening to this podcast. And it's just terrific. Really, really dark stuff going on there. But it has become like that. Yeah.
Really, yeah. I mean, there are whole channels of stuff, that people barely don't. A lot of people, if you only know BBC ITV Channel 4, Channel 5, and maybe Netflix and Amazon Prime, but there are, there's Stars Play as a channel that's available here. You have, as part of Amazon, there's Alibi, which is part of UKTV, which is making new crime dramas. They're often really interesting and good. There's loads, absolutely. It's such a rich world now. Yeah, it's fascinating. And the good thing is, I think that podcasts are helping. Generally people talk about TV. There are loads of TV-based podcasts, I think, apart from my own.
Yeah.
And I think that's lovely. And people was talking about it on social media. I think Twitter, when they're not talking about, I don't know, infuriating, unnuanced debates about politics, they're talking about TV. Really, that's my favorite Twitter is people recommending TV.
Yeah, yeah. And it's also great if you're watching something it's always good to watch The Apprentice and have a look at Twitter at the time, because you're getting this second commentary, this second screen, as they were calling it that about 3 years ago. I don't know if they're still calling it second screen, whether that's still the buzz term. So tell me about the podcast, the Pilot TV podcast. How did it all start, and what's it about?
It all started. The magazine came first, really. So
right, so it's a spin-off from the magazine.
Yeah, it's a spin-off from the magazine, and I have to credit the editor of Empire, Terry White. She's the editor-in-chief of both magazines, and she's been at Empire for a few years now. A brilliant, inspirational figure. And Empire itself, as a film magazine, had to include more and more TV anyway in recent times. Like Game of Thrones, for example. Is a show that every episode's budget was bigger than a lot of films, so it never made sense to ignore those big shows. So they were talking about TV in the magazine, but there was just too much, as I said, good TV to feature in a monthly magazine and just do one or two features or reviews. So it was her idea, really, to have a regular magazine dealing with this, particularly cinematic TV, this kind of stuff we're talking about, these high-end golden age of TV scripted shows mostly. Mm-hmm. So she came to me I've been writing about TV for Heat for 21 years. It's all the same company, so our offices are about 10 feet away. And and together with our friend James, who works on Empire Online, we created the magazine. And then I think very quickly we thought, well, we should do a podcast as well, because if you have at the moment, quarterly magazine, picking out very strong recommendations of what's upcoming in the world of television for the next couple of months, that's fine, that's great, and we can have lavish features, where we celebrate the very best of this stuff. But as I said, because there are 3 or 4 new shows every single week, we decided we had to do a weekly podcast as well. So that's what we do. We talk about, it's a bit like the Empire podcast, which we've been going for years and it's brilliant, hosted by Chris Hewitt, and it's a mixture. We foreground reviews for very much. So that's as in the making sure we make it clear what we think is good and not so good out of all these shows. But we do TV news. We talk about just generally what we're watching at any given time. We have guests every now and then. If there's we have Vicky McClure recently, who was brilliant from Line of Duty. We have, if we get a really good guest is available, we'll get them on as well. But it's a fairly kind of freewheeling weekly, but it's just about the brilliance of TV. It is all about the golden age of TV, basically.
So what show should we not miss right now? What is the don't miss show? Because I'm really bad at this. I got onto Breaking Bad so late, because people would tell me, I'd say, what's it about? And they'd say, well, it's about this guy who has a midlife crisis and he starts making drugs. I'm thinking, I don't want to watch that. But then, it's just a masterpiece.
Yeah.
You can't get enough of it. Now it's Better Call Saul and and still great, Yeah. Apart from that weird finale thing they did, the standalone thing, that was terrible, but yeah.
Oh yeah, the spin-off feature film. Yeah, I didn't mind it, but it wasn't as good. You're right. I know what you mean. Yeah.
So right now, what is it I'm missing?
Right now, BBC One, a good old BBC One, Monday and Tuesdays, 10:45. A bit late. There's a reason for that. I May Destroy You. It's a 12-part kind of drama created by and starring Michaela Cole, who did a very funny comedy called Chewing Gum a few years ago on Channel 4. She's brilliant, and it's about a lot of things, but it's ostensibly about in real life. She suffered a sexual assault a few years ago. She talked about this in a big showpiece speech at the Edinburgh TV Festival, which I was there for. And she said, she told this own very personal story of this trauma she experienced, and she's used that as one of the starting off points to create this extraordinary drama that's kind of actually more than that. It's just generally about her generation, people in their 20s, their attitudes to relationships and sex and consent, and race comes into it a bit. It's very timely, but more than anything, it's it's a completely different show, but it reminds me of This Life. When This Life arrived, it was one of my favorite TV shows of all time. When This Life arrived, it felt like such a reflection of what was happening right there and then. It was in London. It was a group of friends. It was absolutely no holds barred about sex, drugs, drinking, all of that. And this has that quality to it as well. I think it's it feels like it's tapping into a really interesting thing about the way that generation behaves, and social media, Instagram, it's all there, but it's got this core, really fascinating depiction of her own trauma, her own experience. She fictionalizes it. She plays a fictional character. And it is a drama. It's got loads of other things going on, but it is pretty incredible, I think.
And the name of it again, boy?
I May Destroy You.
I May Destroy You.
Yeah.
Okay, so we shouldn't miss that. Now, which is the overhyped show we need to avoid?
It's the overhyped show. That's a good question.
It just didn't live up to its billing.
Thinking now.
It just everybody thought this was going to be great, and you watched it, and it was.
Well, let me remind myself of the title. Sorry, I've forgotten the title of this show. Oh, I know. Yeah. There's a show that's been on Sky Atlantic on Monday nights called I Know This Much Is True. And it's a very brilliant, it's kind of brilliantly made and everything, but it's so bleak and depressing, the subject matter. I mean, obviously, the show I just mentioned, I May Destroy, sounds like it's going to be very bleak, but actually, it's not. It's funny, it's witty, it's darkly comic, if you like, as well as being dramatic and moving all those things. But I Know This Much Is True. It's a story of twins, one of whom is suffering with schizophrenia, and the other has huge big issues as well. It starts off with an incredibly kind of violent moment of self-harm in the very first episode. I mean, you'll know, people who've been watching it will know from right from the beginning if this is for them. For me, it was just too much. I couldn't cope with the relentlessness of it, I have to say. So
what, the violence?
Violence, just general misery, constant misery. Yeah, it was just too much for me, I have to say. Yeah,
it feels like it's probably a completely different thing, but a film I just couldn't get into that I thought was hyped a lot was Adam Sandler Uncut Gems, and that was just too full.
Oh, really? Oh, I like that. Oh, I love that.
You did?
Yeah.
Well, there you go.
Yeah. Views differ.
Of course. Yeah.
I really like, but that was grueling. That was grueling.
Yeah, it was too much for me. I just I don't know if it was because it was him. I wonder, but then I was trying to think, well, who else could have pulled that off? And I really can't think of anyone that could have pulled it off.
Right.
So,
I mean, I think he was brilliant in it. Yeah.
Yeah. No, he probably was.
It's a divisive film because it's so full on, isn't it? And
Yeah.
he is so full on, and the whole style of it is unbelievably intense. The music, and I thought it was very powerful. But yeah, I can see why a lot of people, why you wouldn't like it. Yeah.
All right, couple of more on films then. Best film ever for you?
Oh, wow.
And it can be any nationality as well.
Thanks. Okay.
And you can't pick Citizen Kane because everyone said that too.
I won't pick that. No. Best film ever. Well, The Godfather Part 2 would be up there.
That is a good film.
Yeah,
that is an excellent film.
Famously better than 1, and 1 is extraordinary.
And 3 was a mistake. Yeah.
3 was a mistake. Still, there's things about 3 that I quite like though.
Yeah.
Apocalypse Now would be up there. I'm just going to name it. I have to name a handful.
Yeah.
Apocalypse
Now for me wasn't tucked in at the end properly. It was maybe I just like a Hollywood ending.
Oh, the Marlon Brando climax.
Yeah,
well,
yeah.
I mean, it goes absolutely crazy. I was with it. I know Woody. See, we're talking about cancel culture and all that. I'm a huge Woody Allen fan. And,
I like his stuff too. Annie Hall,
Annie Hall is
great.
The greatest. For me the greatest comedy ever made.
And the great thing about Woody Allen films is you can watch a Woody Allen film, and the film's okay and it ticks along, and there's like just a couple of great lines in it. There's a line in that. Well, no, I mean ones that you actually keep and think are just for me. What was the one that he did with Scarlett Johansson and it was set in England? Near the Albert Hall.
Match Point.
There's a great line in that where he says, "My first wife," or I'm probably getting this all wrong, but he says she said I need to be more assertive, and I had a really good rebuttal. I raised my hand, but she didn't call on me. I mean, that's just great. Oh, yeah. And that film really is not one of Woody Allen's, most beloved films, but it's got that line in it.
Interestingly, I've got the audiobook of his autobiography.
Does he narrate it?
He does. Yeah.
Wow.
So if you want 7.5 hours of Woody Allen talking to you, that's the thing to get. But Match Point is one of his own personal favorites.
Is it?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it wasn't. And I think he went through a period of making some films in Britain, didn't he? In Europe, and some are better than others. His latest film, I have to say, is terrible.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah, but I'm a huge Woody Allen fan. So Annie Hall, Love and Death, those are brilliant. And there's films like Midnight Run, the Robert De Niro, Charles Grodin film that's out and out. It's a comedy thriller. That's one of my favorite films of all time.
Yeah,
for sure. And I'm a huge Brian De Palma fan. I don't know if you've seen Dressed to Kill. Obviously, he did Scarface, Untouchables, but Dressed to Kill is a sick and twisted stalk and slash horror film. That's that's in my top 5, definitely. There you go.
A foreign one? You got a foreign one for us as well?
Well, Persona. Talking of Woody Allen, a huge Ingmar Bergman fan.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you've seen Persona, but Persona is a fascinating film. A film that rests on an epic storytelling moment in the middle of it. So one of the characters tells this story, and it's goes on for ages, and it's astonishing, what is going on with this story. And it starts off in a very bizarre, confusing, bewildering way, but it's riveting and incredible. Just unique, nothing else like it, I don't think.
I think for me, favorite non-English language film be The Lives of Others, the German film.
Oh yeah, that was great.
I think that's a fantastic film.
Oh yeah, that is a classic, 100%.
That's a really good film.
Classic. Yeah, brilliant. Yeah. I mean, of course, Parasite this year.
Yeah.
South Korean film.
Yeah,
dark,
but good. Yeah,
brilliantly won Best Picture at the Oscars, which people slag off the Oscars, but that was that's a masterpiece. I've seen that 4 or 5 times, that film.
Yeah,
and that is extraordinary, and that's brilliant that a foreign language film won the Best Picture Oscar. Incredible.
Yeah. Let's talk about podcasts then. So besides Pilot TV podcast, what podcast do you listen to?
Can I quickly mention my Arsenal one as well? I've got
Of course,
Arsenal. Thank you.
Just before we go on to one of the podcasts, while you've brought up Arsenal, what's gone wrong there? What do they need to get right?
Oh, I mean, you have to listen to my podcast every week.
Okay.
I mean, it's a long and depressing saga. I think now, by the way, Mikel Arteta, our new manager, is going to sort it all out. But it's a mixture of lack of investment. We've got a billionaire American owner who doesn't give a shit.
Yeah.
With Arsene Wenger went on way too long. He should have left 5 years earlier than he did. It's all of those things. But I'm very hopeful with Mikel Arteta in charge, and we've got some brilliant players. So,
and your podcast is called the Arsenal podcast.
Footballistically Arsenal, which is a word that Arsene Wenger coined famously a while ago.
Okay. So other podcasts you listen to?
Other podcasts. I'm a huge fan of. There's a podcast called Talk Art, which is Russell Tovey, the actor, who's a friend of mine, a brilliant guy. And he collects art. That's his huge hobby, huge big obsession in his life. And with his friend Robert Diament, who's a gallerist, they have celebrity guests usually, or they have artists themselves. They've had Elton John on, Lena Dunham. They've had incredible guests. But them talking about art is inspirational, and you learn it's very accessible. It's them just chatting away about the art that they love, whether it's sculpture, painting, conceptual art, anything, photography. That's brilliant. I'm a huge fan of kind of good, what I call conversation podcasts. Not like this really. Where it's not an interview, it's people chatting to each other. And of course, Mark Maron, everyone knows Mark Maron is the god of that.
Yeah.
And I have every now and then I feel with Mark, he slightly irritates me. But his recent one with Jerry Seinfeld
I've seen that come up. I haven't listened to that yet. Yeah. I saw it on my phone this morning actually, and I thought, because with Maron he does that many, and they are so long. You have to go. Have I heard of that person? Yeah. Okay. Right. Yeah. Right. If you haven't heard of them, I skip them unfortunately because he just does so much. Yeah. But the Jerry one is good.
The Jerry one's brilliant. And he has a completely different philosophy of comedy from Jerry. Like Mark Maron, and again, I don't quite agree.
Yeah, Jerry's about jokes, isn't he? Yeah.
Jerry's about jokes, exactly, and about, everyday observations. Mark Maron's about intense, looking at his issues and, his addictions and all of that and what's happened in his life. And that's brilliant. Yeah. And that is of course, that's a brilliant, but he thinks that all comedy, all stand-up should be reflective of your inner self, really.
Right.
And they have this they clash about it, but it's so fascinating. It's two, really brilliant talents with a totally different philosophy, kind of debating it. I think it's brilliant. I think Louis Theroux's recent one that he started is great.
Yeah.
Conversations.
Yeah.
I loved the episode with Boy George. I thought that was brilliant.
Yeah.
Lenny Henry episode was great. So I am a big consumer. Fortunately, with Fee Glover and Jane Garvey, I love. And of course, I mean, Mark Kermode and Simon Mayo. I'm lucky enough. For a couple of years, I stood in for Mark on that show.
Right.
I was lucky enough to be like the holiday sub, and that was like one of the greatest honors of my life. Seriously, because Mark Kermode talking about film for a couple of hours every week is absolutely unmissable for me. Yeah. So there'll be the ones. Dear Joan and Jericho, I've just remembered one more, because Sue Perkins' new podcast, she's doing the second series of her podcast, and her first guests were Dear Joan and Jericho, who are the fictional creations, who are fictional agony arts. I don't know if you've ever heard their podcast.
No, I haven't heard that one.
They are hilarious, and they are the rudest podcast you will ever hear in your life. So it's not for the squeamish, I warn you now, but they are absolutely hilarious.
Thanks for the warning then, Boyd. So the one to listen to, though, is the Pilot TV podcast. It's available everywhere, and we'll see where it ends up in the podcast radio chart on the Pod 20. I've got a feeling it will make the chart, because so far all of my guests have made the chart.
That's as it should be. Really, isn't it? Yeah. That's fair enough.
All right. Great to talk to you. What are you looking forward to?
What am I looking forward to? Oh, I'm looking forward to, there's a new Perry Mason. Do you remember Perry Mason?
Yeah, the lawyer.
Yeah, the lawyer, played by Raymond Burr in the 60s.
Yeah.
They've rebooted it with Matthew Rhys, the Welsh actor Matthew Rhys. That's going to be on Sky soon. And I'm very much looking forward to that. And above all else, though, I mean, of course, there's only one answer. The football season's back.
Yes, it's back. Next week,
Arsenal,
isn't it?
The first day, Man City Arsenal. I mean, my whole life's going to change that night, next Wednesday,
Yeah. Boyd Hilton, thank you very much. It's been great to talk to you.
Thanks, Graham. Cheers.
Thanks a lot. Best of luck with the Pilot TV podcast.
Thank you.